أعزائي المشاهدين، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته، وأسعد الله أوقاتكم بكل خير. ونحن في حلقة جديدة من برنامج الحد الادنى. لهذه الحلقة خصوصية نسبة لخصوصية الضيف الذي يتحدث إلينا في هذه الحلقة، وهو سعادة السيد هاربيرد، وهو عضو حزب المحافظين في البرلمان البريطاني. تم انتخابه عام 2005 عن مقاطعة أرندل في بريطانيا، وهو في حزب المحافظين تم تعيينه بواسطة رئيس الوزراء السابق ديفيد كاميرون ليكون وزير للظل، وتقلد عدة مناصب وزارية في حكومة الظل، حيث تولى وزير للإصلاح الشرطة عام 2005، وكذلك عمل أيضا وزيرا في حكومة الظل عام 2007. تقلد عدة مناصب وهي وزيرا للعدل، البيئة، توفير الطعام والشؤون الريفية. تميز مضيفنا اليوم هاربيرد بعدد من المزايا التي جعلته يقدم إسهامات عميقة وكبيرة جدا على مستوى العالم في المجال الصحي، حيث قدم مبادرة من أجل محاربة مرض السل في العالم. سنتحدث عن ذلك في عام 2012. كما أطلق مبادرة في كل دول الاتحاد الأوروبي عن الإصلاح في كتلة المحافظين الأوروبية، ولديه مواقف أيضا في قضية البريكزيت، أو ما يسمى خروج بريطانيا من الاتحاد الأوروبي. Mr. and Honorable Harbert, welcome to our show.
Thank you.
I mean, it might be good to start with the question that why you are in Sudan. What are you doing here?
I chair a global TB caucus, tuberculosis caucus, which I set up 4 years ago with South Africa's Health Minister, Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi, because we were concerned that there was insufficient attention on TB, the world's deadliest infectious disease. It kills more than 1.7 million people every year, completely unnecessarily. And we wanted to try and get more parliamentarians around the world focused on the problem and work together between different countries to try and drive political action to beat the disease. And since we launched the caucus with just a few members of parliament 4 years ago, we now have 2,500 parliamentarians in 130 countries. We've set up 40 national TB caucuses, including here in Sudan. And I was very keen to come here to meet those that had set up the caucus to discuss the issues, particularly because in just 2 weeks' time we have a meeting at the United Nations in New York of heads of government who will be discussing a new plan to beat tuberculosis. That's something we've all been working very hard on over the last few months. And so we're discussing that meeting, and also crucially, what do we do after the meeting to ensure that the plan is put into action?
I wonder, during your capacity as a MB member in UK Parliament, did you have a chance to visit Sudan before?
No. When I was a minister, I had a domestic-facing brief, so I didn't do much international travel. I do quite a bit of travel now because of the various committees that I chair, including to Africa, but I'd not been to Sudan before. So I'm very pleased indeed to have the opportunity to come. British parliamentarians do visit Sudan. I know that
yes.
Colleagues are coming just next week, I think, from our...
Correct.
We have an all-party parliamentary group.
For Sudan and South Sudan.
And that's coming.
Yes.
And I know that ministers come as well. So I personally think it's a very good thing if parliamentarians can visit other countries. And in turn, I think it's a very good thing for us to welcome parliamentarians from other countries in the UK. I think this exchange of views and information, not always with agreement about things, but understanding different positions and working together where we can on issues is good for all countries. And certainly the Global TB Caucus has been strong precisely because it does work across a large number of countries, and parliamentarians from all sorts of different backgrounds, speaking different languages, but we can cooperate and be stronger together on the important issue of beating a disease that, after all, has no boundaries. TB doesn't observe national boundaries. It's an airborne infectious disease. And TB anywhere is TB everywhere.
Honorable Mr. Harbert, I mean, this is absolutely your initiative for this sort of TB caucus is highly appreciated by the normal people in Africa. But at the same time, other initiatives have been failed before. That has been set up in a global format. Like malaria is still a wide spread disease. Different initiative, and also, I mean, the effort of the International Health Organization couldn't do anything right now. Other like Ebola. I mean, how can you make sure that this initiative will be successful?
I think you're right that these diseases have been stubborn. Malaria is coming down. It now faces drug resistance as an issue, which has halted the rate of progress, but malaria is much more under control than it used to. There is an ambition that was set by the Sustainable Development Goals, signed up to by all the world's leaders 4 years ago, to beat all of these diseases, malaria, AIDS, and tuberculosis, by 2030. Goal 3.3 says that those diseases will be eliminated. Well, at the current rate of progress, it is possible we will beat AIDS then, possible we will beat malaria then, but TB, at the current rate of progress, will not be beaten for over a century. So that's how far off target we are. And now TB has more deaths every year than malaria and AIDS combined. So actually, the progress that has been made on those diseases has not been replicated for tuberculosis. It was declared a global health emergency 25 years ago by the World Health Organization. Since then, there have been 50 million deaths. Can you imagine if a new disease was identified tomorrow by the World Health Organization and they told the world that it would be airborne, highly infectious, susceptible to drug resistance, that yes, it could be cured, but it was difficult to diagnose and the drugs wouldn't always be available. They had to be taken over a long period of time. And what's more, this new disease would kill nearly 2 million people a year. There would be an outcry. And yet that is the position that we have with tuberculosis, and it's just accepted. And I say it's no longer acceptable. This is a treatable, beatable, curable disease. It has been since antibiotics were invented. There should not be this prevalence of tuberculosis. We should not be tolerating it. And the world can beat it. And that's what the high-level meeting in New York in 2 weeks' time has got to decide.
I mean, Honorable Mr. Harbert, I mean, do you think WHO is doing enough to fight this disease? Bearing in mind that most of the cases, and the majority of the cases in underdeveloped countries, are mostly in Africa. I mean, why WHO is not doing enough for this?
It's not just the WHO, remember. There are other multilateral institutions, including the Global Fund, which do an enormous amount in Africa, partnering with member state countries to finance the fight against AIDS, malaria and tuberculosis. And the UK is the second largest donor to the Global Fund. We give £1 billion in the last replenishment to the Global Fund. Only the United States gives more. So I think that there are effective multinational institutions, but actually every country has also got to do more itself. It's not just a question of aid. It is also a question of ensuring that in each country there is a functioning health system and that there is an infrastructure that can do the basic things that are needed to tackle this disease. And if you don't have that infrastructure, you have other problems anyway. So this is not impossible. It will not take an impossible amount of resources to deal with this problem. The WHO, I think, to be fair, there was a Millennium Development Goal to halve the prevalence of TB, and that was met, but the target was insufficiently ambitious. Now we have an ambitious target to beat the disease altogether in less than 15 years' time. But let's be clear, at the current rate, there will be another 30 million deaths by the time that target is, by the time 2030 is reached, and we won't have beaten it. So the world is off track. And we all have to, the first thing we all have to understand is that we are off track, that we're not collectively doing enough. And I fully accept that the wealthier countries have a role to play in donations to organizations like the Global Fund, but each individual country has a role to play as well.
But I mean, the international community has less focus on this kind of disease. Is that because, you know, the most affected people in underdeveloped countries in Africa?
I think there's some truth in that. I think TB is a disease of poverty, of the poor, and when it flared back up again in the 1980s, when the West thought it had beaten TB, I think that there was not the attention on it that there was on AIDS. There was attention on AIDS because it was also affecting populations in Western countries.
Correct.
And as a consequence also, there was much more investment in research and development and new drugs because the pharmaceutical companies knew they had a market. And there was much more government money too. So if you look at actually what's happened to AIDS, there are amazing new drugs now. We know that AIDS is no longer a death sentence. You can be HIV positive and take a single drug every day and live a perfectly normal life. There is a prophylactic that prevents you getting AIDS. We are not immediately close, but there is in sight the possibility of a vaccine to prevent AIDS altogether. This is all because of the vast sums of money that have been ploughed into research. That hasn't happened for tuberculosis. We're still using the same drugs by and large as the drugs that were first discovered half a century ago. And those have to be taken over a period of months. And there is a danger then of drug resistance because people stop taking them. And it means that the treatment is not as quick and as effective as it should be for a disease of this type. Then there's also the risk of drug resistance, which is very severe.
Correct.
And we need new drugs for that. So we need new drugs. We need a vaccine. Most people in the West believe there's a vaccine for TB, and there isn't. I did when I first started work in this area. I visited Kenya. I went to a hospital in Nairobi, and I was told how bad the situation was, and I put up my hand, and I said, well, why aren't you vaccinating everyone? Because I hadn't read my briefing. And there's no adult vaccine for tuberculosis. There's insufficient funding going in to develop a vaccine. And that's what I was told. And it was the experience of what I saw then in Kenya and the realization that there simply wasn't enough world attention on this problem and people were dying unnecessarily. That's what motivated me so strongly to start a committee in the UK Parliament to lobby hard for more work to be done on this issue and then to broaden that into a global parliamentary campaign, which has now become, I think, a force in its own right.
What was your discussion with Sudanese parliamentary group here? Are they on board supporting this initiative right now?
The Sudanese parliamentarians here are very strongly on board. They have done a wonderful job. The chairperson of the parliament launched the caucus here in Sudan. It was one of the first African caucuses to be launched in our initiative. And they've been working very hard to promote new action to tackle the disease. And if, as we expect at the United Nations shortly, a new program is agreed, it will set an ambitious target of increasing the number of patients that are detected who have TB. And that will require more to be done in Sudan, even though the rate of TB isn't as high as it is in sub-Saharan African countries elsewhere. Nevertheless, there is some TB in Sudan, as there is in the UK. And we've all got to do more to step up and beat the disease.
Okay, thank you very much for that clarification. I think it is set up that this initiative will be kicked off in New York at the margin of the General Assembly meeting on 26th of September.
That's right.
And we're expecting a political declaration from the head states.
Exactly.
What are the content?
Well, the content will be to declare that TB is a disease that requires more action and to explain why, and then commit the governments to meet the target that has already been set in the Sustainable Development Goal to beat the disease by 2030. And then it will specifically say that more cases have to be detected so as to be able to meet that target. It will say that there needs to be more resources, that there needs to be new drugs, more research and development into a vaccine, new diagnostics, new drugs. It will be, I think, a very good declaration, and we expect a large number of heads of government to be there to launch it. The question will be, will each individual country then follow through? And that will require follow through in the West, and it will require follow through in the high burden countries, because every single country will have to play its part to ensure that TB can be eliminated.
I mean, this initiative had been jointly initiated with South Africa.
Yes.
Why did you choose South Africa particularly for this initiative?
Well, when we were discussing the launch of the Parliamentary Caucus, I had already been working with Dr. Motsioledi because he was chairman of the Stop TB Partnership, which is the UN body that is charged with campaigning on tuberculosis. But it was also because he has such a fantastic record in South Africa of addressing these issues and of doing so much more in relation to AIDS, TB, and so on. So he is a great champion in the fight against tuberculosis, but he is also himself a parliamentarian. He's a minister and a member of parliament, and that was why he was a natural person to team up with, because I think the important thing about the Global TB Caucus is it represents an alliance across countries that are high burden, that are affected very strongly by tuberculosis, and countries like the UK that have a low burden of TB, but are in a position to try and help to do something about it. And what we try and do is forge an alliance between parliamentarians in these differently affected countries to say that we live in one world, we have a common aim, a humanitarian aim, but also the aim of preventing drug resistance flare-up. So there is a national security implication. Also the aim of trying to boost the global economy, because tuberculosis represents a considerable drag on the global economy because millions of people are sick. 10 million people get sick every year from tuberculosis. There's a huge economic cost of failing to tackle the disease. And all of this is quite unnecessary. You know, we could be on top of this disease. And my message to global leaders is always, look, you face many intractable problems, things that are near impossible to solve, but this is something you could solve. You just have to put your mind to it.
I mean, another question also the same line. UK is being committed to provide 0.7%
yes.
of its national GDP for development in the whole world. 2 weeks ago, we have seen Prime Minister Theresa May in Africa promoting relations, trade, and economy. We notice that a small figure of this amount that UK is providing to Africa, to the whole world, and specifically Africa, is a peanut for health. I mean, it is always for humanitarian assistance, some minor kind of development, but UK is ignoring health in Africa. And we saw also that during the visit of the Prime Minister, only focusing on trade and economy, but not full attention to this kind of diseases in Africa.
Well, I don't think that's a fair criticism, actually, because as I've already mentioned, the UK is the second biggest donor in the world to the Global Fund to tackle AIDS, tuberculosis and malaria. I said we give, the last replenishment we gave £1 billion, and that is a huge sum of money. Only the United States of America, which is a much bigger economy than the UK, gives more. So I think we have a very proud record of assistance in relation actually to tackling all of these diseases, AIDS, malaria and tuberculosis. Of course, when we give money to the Global Fund, it is then spent in the name of the Global Fund, not in the name of the UK. But we are yet the second biggest contributor. So many African countries will be receiving Global Fund resources in order to help the fight against tuberculosis, AIDS, malaria, including Sudan. But they won't necessarily be aware that that money is, to a considerable extent, coming from the UK. On top of that, we do have bilateral programs in all three areas. We have a huge research and development program. And as you mentioned, we have increased our international development spending. we have locked that into law that we spend 0.7% of our gross national income every single year. There are very few countries that do that, very few, and certainly not of the size of the UK. That is a generous contribution for the British people to make, because remember that we have had ourselves a financial crisis in the last 10 years. We have had to cut public spending in many areas, including our own health system has been under pressure, although we've increased spending, but not by as much as many of my constituents, for instance, would like. And yet we continue to give more money for international development. Now, I think that's the right thing to do, but I certainly don't think we can be criticised for a lack of support.
Are you expecting support from international community during the TB summit in New York on 26th of September, mainly from Western countries, to support this initiative?
I think there will be good support from heads of government from all over the world. It's not clear finally which heads of government are going, but we know that there are some very prominent leaders going, including, I believe, the President of South Africa, which will be very important. Those that don't go will still be signing up to the declaration. So attendance isn't necessary for the world's leaders to agree the declaration. This is the first time that such a meeting has ever been held on tuberculosis at the United Nations. The first time that heads of government have been invited to address the issue of TB alone, not HIV/AIDS, not malaria, not international development generally, but specifically and only about tuberculosis. So it's a very important moment. And to have a collection of a large number of heads of government from all over the world at the UN, making this declaration, speaking to the UN, will be very important. But what will really matter is that we then hold them to account for the promises they make. And the parliamentarians will have a big role to play in that, because back in our own countries, in our national parliaments, we will need to stand up in our parliaments and say to our health ministers, to our prime ministers, to our finance ministers, you made this commitment, you said you were going to beat tuberculosis, you knew that that would mean that it required more resources and more application, what are you doing? And that's why this declaration will be so important.
Honorable Harbert, I mean, a country like Sudan, suffering from TB in some areas, specifically at the Red Sea area over there, what do you think the right strategy that within the context of your initiative, Sudan can follow to eradicate this disease?
Well, I've been discussing the issue today with parliamentarians and your health ministry, and tomorrow there is going to be a seminar conducted, and I will be listening to all of the proposals, and we'll be given briefings about what is going on. And it is up to the Sudanese authorities and experts and your health experts to develop a program.
But we mean the modalities.
But in general, the learning is the same actually all over the world, which is that you have to, first of all, find the cases of tuberculosis. There are a lot of hidden cases of tuberculosis. They don't necessarily present themselves. Mm-hmm. So you have actively to go out and find the cases, particularly in the vulnerable populations where you know TB is going to be more likely. Migrant populations, mining populations, places where there is especially poor housing or poverty, prisons. There are places where TB is particularly prevalent, and you have to identify those areas because they can be places where there are reservoirs, a large amount of TB, and ensure that you are identifying those patients. Then you have to diagnose them, and then you have to treat them. And all of this has been known for decades. It's a question of organisation, actually. It's a question of organisation and focus in ensuring that it happens. TB in its ordinary form is perfectly treatable once you have identified the patient, once they've been diagnosed with TB, and once they've been put on the treatment regime. It requires an effective primary health infrastructure, but even in countries with, which have had much lower rates of TB, like the UK, we find that we still have to now train TB nurses. We have to ensure that we have our doctors understand when they are seeing cases of TB, because we thought we'd beaten this and now it's coming back. So there is an education program within the health community as well that is necessary.
I think before we go to break, we have one question related to this, and because we are going to touch on the refugee crisis, people from Africa crossing to Europe through different directions. I mean, the question is connected to TB because some countries close doors, building walls, preventing these refugees to come to their country because of inherited diseases like TB.
Yeah.
I mean, principally, do you think this is the right approach, just preventing refugees because they have some diseases coming from home, like people having TBs coming from Africa, because as some leaders in Europe say that, you know, we would like to keep our community healthy, clean, and we don't like to have diseases coming from with refugees from some continent.
I think if you have refugees who are fleeing in fear of persecution and for their lives, then that is a humanitarian issue.
Can we listen to your answer after the break?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you very much. أعزائي المشاهدين فاصل قصير ثم نعود فابقوا معنا. أعزائي المشاهدين السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. نواصل حلقتنا في برنامج الحد الادنى مع عضو البرلمان البريطاني هاربيرد الذي يقود مبادرة دولية من أجل محاربة السل الرئوي من كل العالم، وهو الآن في زيارة إلى السودان للالتقاء بعدد من البرلمانيين السودانيين من أجل تشكيل هذه الكتلة على مستوى العالم لمحاربة السل في العالم. وكما ذكرنا في مقدمة هذا البرنامج أن نيويورك ستستضيف على هامش اجتماعات الجمعية العامة ما يسمى قمة يحضرها رؤساء البلدان لإعلان سياسي من أجل محاربة السل في العالم. Honorable Mr. Harbert, we just stopped before the break asking you about the refugee crisis and inherited diseases coming to Europe. So please, you can continue your answer.
I mean, my view is that if people are fleeing persecution, then that is a humanitarian issue. And the fact that they need medical treatment should not be an impediment to offering them support and asylum if appropriate. You can screen for a disease like TB, and that is important to establish that somebody has TB and therefore needs treatment, but that shouldn't necessarily be a reason not to accept them fleeing from a country. I think we have to distinguish between refugees, those who are fleeing persecution, and economic migration.
Yes.
And the real problem that that Europe has faced has been more related to economic migration and so on. Although, of course, you know, there is also a very substantial refugee problem that's arisen from North Africa as a consequence of some of the conflicts that we've seen, and from Asia. That has been something that Europe has found it very, very difficult to deal with, and has challenged some of the fundamental tenets on which Europe has been organised in relation to free movement and support for each other.
Honourable Mr. Harbert, I think we're going to touch upon some home politics.
Sure.
Okay, internal politics. You are, as a politician and MP, you had served as a shadow minister during David Cameron government before, and different profiles. I mean, injustice, police reforming, environment, and rural issues. And you had an initiative about reformation within conservative parties in Europe before. I mean, what is the idea of having a reformation initiative within the conservative European political parties?
I'm not sure exactly what your question is about. Is it about reform and modernisation of the Conservative Party, or is it about policy on Europe?
No, I mean the reformation of the conservative parties.
Oh, when we left one grouping and joined another. Yes, that was some time ago when David Cameron became Prime Minister, Conservative Prime Minister. He felt that the Conservative Party would more naturally join a European grouping that had a vision that was less federalist than the grouping that we were in, that was less committed to deep European integration and more shared our belief in open and flexible markets. And that was why he decided to change our grouping. That happened some time ago.
Yes, I mean, this will be connected to Brexit. You were so active, you have different perspectives about the referendum, about the negotiation going on right now under the leadership of the government of Prime Minister Theresa May in UK. Can you kindly explain your views about the policies of the referendum? How can UK would approach the issue?
I was one of the leaders of the campaign to remain in the European Union. I thought it was a mistake to leave, but we lost the argument. We had a referendum. We don't have many referendums in the UK. Normally we settle matters by parliamentary vote. Exceptionally on this issue, because it crossed party lines and was of such fundamental importance, we decided to hold a referendum.
Do you think people were misled about the argument on why leaving?
I think that some of the claims that were made, particularly by the Leave campaign, were wrong, but I'm not sure how much any of that would have changed the final vote. And in the end, my view is that in a democracy you have to respect the results of elections. And I think that nothing would be more damaging than to hold a referendum where one side wins by a decisive majority, albeit relatively small, but nevertheless decisive. 2 million more people voted to leave than to remain. It was clear cut. And then to turn around to them and say, you know what, we're not going to pay any attention to your view, I think that would be really very damaging. And that is the view of the majority of members of Parliament and the public, that however we voted, and I was on the Remain side, we respect the result, and now we try and put that result into place. Britain leaves the EU by the end of March next
2019,
year.
Yeah.
But we are going to leave the EU, but we need to do that in a sensible manner that respects the fact that European countries are our close partners, that we need to cooperate with them on many issues, and in particular that they are our largest single market. We do the majority of our trade, over half of our trade overall, with countries in the European Union, and that is at the moment borderless. There is frictionless trade, so we need to be very careful to put in place new arrangements that while we will be outside the European Union, we want to ensure that we can trade freely with the European Union. And that's what the discussion is about at the moment. And different people have different views about what the right arrangements should be. I sometimes say that there are 650 members of Parliament in the UK and 650 different views about what Brexit should look like. But the Prime Minister and the Cabinet have set out their view. That is the UK's negotiating position with the EU now, and I believe that we should support it.
But there are some voices, calling for another referendum. Do you support that?
No, and I appreciate that there are some voices. I have not supported them. I don't think that it is right to turn around to the British public and say, you got the result wrong the first time, so you should have another go. They tend to do that in other European countries. I don't think that would be the right response in the UK. It was made quite clear when we held this referendum that the government would implement it, the result of it.
But Honourable Mr. Harbert, do you think that putting referendum, leaving EU on the table first place was a political gamble at that time?
I think it was inevitable. I think there had been years of debate about whether we should be in the European Union or not. And the Prime Minister then, David Cameron, felt that that issue needed to be settled, that otherwise it would just run on and on, bedeviling UK politics. And a referendum had been promised to the British people before by Tony Blair on the European Constitution, and then he reneged on that. And that left a very uncomfortable situation where the British public felt that they had been promised a say and then it had been taken away. So we, ever since then, felt that it was important to give the British public a say. And it's quite hard to turn around and say to the British public, you know what, we know better than you. We're just going to stay in. even though we know that a large number of you have a concern about this. I think the Prime Minister then felt that it was right to try and settle it. He also thought that Britain would vote to remain in the European Union.
Yes.
And at the time, I don't think anybody could have predicted the result. But remember, what he was trying to do was to achieve a more flexible European Union, recognizing that the Eurozone countries, those that share the euro, which we don't in the UK,
Yes.
would want to deepen their economies to have more integration. And he thought that they would need treaty change to do that. And actually, they decided that they didn't. So there was a logic in holding the referendum. And at the time that he made that speech and pledged it, many people were very pleased that he had finally agreed, that at last a government had agreed that this issue would be put back to the British people for the first time since 1975. But of course, those who feel very strongly that we should remain didn't want to see a referendum at all in the first place.
Correct.
And now they regret having one. But that's democracy. You know, in a democracy,
We should respect democracy.
the people decide. And they don't always decide in a way that we think is right. But I'd rather live in a democracy where the people are in charge than have others dictate their views to people, where there is no real accountability.
Thank you very much for that. Having in mind the process of negotiation right now with EU, I think there are some difficulties, such like, I mean, the soft borders, whether to remain in the economic zone of EU and leaving politically, and all that. But I think EU negotiators are taking very hard line against this process. How do you perceive the end of the negotiation? How do you think UK should end up at the moment of negotiation with EU?
I think we will end up with an agreement because I think it's in the interest of both sides to have one. I think that it could go to the wire, and obviously this is a tough negotiation. I think we need an arrangement that keeps us as close to the European Union as possible, consistent with the referendum result, that essentially said we want to control our money, our borders, and our laws. And I think that the British public would be entirely content to remain in some kind of European market, but not to be within the political structures of the European Union. I think that's broadly where the British public want to be. There is a section of the
and
British
soft borders
public,
as well with the neighbouring countries.
Yes, there is. The public want to control our borders. They don't want uncontrolled migration, and that was certainly one of the drivers of the referendum result.
Correct.
And I think that Europe in the past has been insufficiently flexible. And this is perhaps some learning for them as they negotiate now in the run-up to this agreement. They just need to reflect on the fact that they got it wrong before. You know, they wouldn't agree as much as they should have done in David Cameron's renegotiation. And he explained that we were concerned about our borders, that we were concerned about the level of migration, which was exceptionally high to the UK. He wanted more control of it, and effectively they said no. And they miscalculated because the British public said, well, in that case, we will take back control. And they have got to be careful not to miscalculate again. You know, this will require give and take on both sides. And it's not in Europe's interest for there to be no deal. It's not in the UK's interest either, but it's certainly not in the UK's interest. We buy and sell to each other. We need close cooperation. We do need to continue to trade, and we need frictionless trade. And there are some countries that trade a lot with the UK from within the European Union, the Netherlands, for instance, Ireland, that are particularly concerned about that. There is a view in some parts of the European Union that somehow the UK has to be punished, that you can't allow the UK to have a relationship that is in any way better than the arrangement that they had before, because then other countries might leave. But you have to respect the fact that the UK is a very large economy. It's Europe's second largest economy. It's the fourth or fifth largest economy in the world. And it is important to have a sensible trading relationship with it. Correct. So I think there will be tough negotiation, but in the end I think there will be a deal. And I hope that it's a pragmatic deal. There are ideologues. There are people on either side of the argument, fervent believers in European integration, or those who want to detach the UK entirely. I don't think they represent the majority.
We would like just to touch upon the issue of terrorism. I mean, during your service as a minister shadow minister, I mean, you come across different questions regarding the internal terrorism. Why do you think that the rate of internal terrorism is increasing in the UK?
Well, it's certainly been a very serious issue in the UK, and we've had a number of serious incidents, as you know, and we have a situation where the country is on a very high state of alert, and there have been terrorist attacks in different parts of the UK, but also specifically on the Houses of Parliament, and large numbers of people actually over the last couple of years have lost their lives in attacks, as they have done in other countries too.
Correct.
Other European countries, in Germany and France. So this situation is not unique to us. It does seem to be born out of a radicalized minority that have taken what I think is a perverted view of Islam and translated that into a theology that says that it is okay to attack what they believe to be the enemies of Islam.
Yes.
I don't think that that is any part of Islam as a whole, which is a peaceful religion. I think this is a minority that have been corrupted, and I think that we have to take every possible step to ensure that that is challenged, and that has to be challenged from the whole country and from within our Muslim communities as well. The vast majority of citizens in the United Kingdom, including our citizens who are Muslims, live side by side entirely peacefully. And I think the levels of integration are quite high, but there is a very small minority where that is not the case, and there's undoubtedly a very strong influence from overseas as well. So we have to tackle the terrorist threat at home. We have to support tackling it abroad at source, and I believe that we have a collective interest globally in challenging this perversion of a great faith, in challenging it internally and saying it does not represent Islam, that actually it is never right to drive a truck into innocent civilians. It's never right to bomb innocent civilians. Violence is never justified. The attack on peaceful people for some kind of religious or political end is never justified, and so on, and we should stand collectively against it.
I mean, you are right when you said that, you know, the social integration in UK is really high. Comparing with other European countries, yes, like France, I mean, this has really caused a lot of social unrest and also different challenges. But again, regarding do you think that as a reaction to this incident of terrorism in the UK, the sense and perception for Islamophobia as well is growing as a phenomenon against this kind of incident, like a style of resistance to this, or is still under control?
I think that is a danger. And indeed, there is a kind of cynicism about those who are orchestrating these attacks, that they want to generate a reaction because they believe that they are at war, and they want to try and create the sense of a population that there is such a war. And we have to stand against that and say that we reject it, and that we subscribe to universal human values and treat our citizens equally, regard our citizens equally, that freedom of religion is incredibly important in the United Kingdom, and we've always respected that, that this is not in any way an argument with Islam. It is not.
Yes.
It is an argument with a very small minority who have perverted their view and have perverted and claim Islam, I think, falsely. I think the most important voices that can speak out about this are those from within the Muslim communities in the United Kingdom and elsewhere themselves. And sometimes those voices are drowned out in the media. But I think we should stand against any kind of hatred that is building towards a religious minority, just as we should against any religion. And there's also been concern about hatred that's been building towards Jewish people in the United Kingdom. And the sources are the same. The sources are the mistaken view that we are not, that somehow as human beings we have fundamental differences that require us to go to war with each other, and we do not. We do not, you know, and we certainly don't in the United Kingdom. The vast majority of us, almost all of us, subscribe to fundamental values of freedom, decency, tolerance, freedom of expression, freedom of religion's expression, living side by side. That is, we regard that as fundamental to what being a British citizen is.
Correct.
I think it's so important to challenge those, whether they're those that are peddling hate against a religion, or whether it's those that are picking up a religion and using it as an excuse for their fight. Both need challenging.
You know, irregular migration, this is a sensitive issue also, drive the British people voting on the referendum for leaving EU. And another comparative view coming from across the Atlantic from US. I mean, President Trump has very hard and harsh policies regarding this, and especially building walls, I mean, across the boundaries with Mexico, and, you know, preventing irregular migration, and have very tough policies. UK is going the same way, and some intellectuals say that, you know, this is a sense of populism that touched the nerve of UK politics of preventing irregular
I mean,
migration.
just to say the UK is not going the same way as some of those policies that you described in the United States. I mean, there have been some policies which I think most people in the UK would regard as abhorrent. For instance, the return of children, separating children from families and so on, which I think
It's not happening in the UK.
Appalled by. But I think there is this truth, though, that if conventional politics won't answer the concerns of reasonable people, then you allow populist, nativist politics to step in its place. And I think it is a fundamental error not to recognise that there is a perfectly reasonable concern about the scale of migration, which has taken place to the UK over the last few years, which has resulted in, for instance, pressure on public services, which has resulted in some people feeling that they have been left behind, and so on. And I think it's very important to address those concerns in a reasonable way. And almost every country in the world controls migration in a reasonable way. It is perfectly reasonable to have a sensible migration policy. The problem with Europe's policy was that it required an absence of borders that meant that we were no longer in control of the levels of people from within Europe coming to our country. And I think that if conventional politics won't address these concerns in a reasonable and balanced way, then you give the platform to those who will make the extreme argument. And I think that was the mistake in the UK, was not to address sooner the concerns about the depth of European integration, not to address sooner the concerns about uncontrolled migration, to allow the debate to be taken away from us. Then you get the more extreme response. And I think that's happened in the United States. And I think Europe as a whole, perhaps the Western world, is suffering from this crisis of conventional politics, which has failed large numbers of citizens, partly because of the global downturn. People feeling that they're being left behind, that their politicians aren't giving them the basic things that they need, which is a job and a good income, and protection from the forces of globalization. And if we fail to do that, then somebody else will come in with an easy, populist solution. And the great tragedy is often those aren't solutions at all. They sound good, they attract public support, but they don't deliver for the people.
But you don't think that the British people really are afraid of the composition of the cosmopolitan structure of the society in UK?
I think a lot of things got elided. I think that there was a concern about the very high level of net migration to the UK that was exceptionally high. Not just, it wasn't just a concern that was built around who was coming in. It was a concern about the numbers, about then the impact on public services, on housing, and so on. I think that debate...
It has nothing to do with the social fabric of the society.
Yes, but I think I think that debate then got confused with the debate about terrorism, about whether our borders were too porous to people that were coming in to harm our country. That debate then got confused with the debate about Europe's migration. And people were exploiting that. They were exploiting fears and so on. So I think it's important to come up with good, sensible, balanced policy solutions that say, yes, we will have a sensible level of migration according to what our economy needs, but we will be in control of it. We will make certain that people are coming to the country when we want them to come, with the appropriate skills that fill the gaps in our employment market. And that has always been good for the UK and will continue. But what we won't have is uncontrolled migration. Now that's a perfectly reasonable policy response, but it wasn't one that was possible while we were a member of the EU. And I say this as someone who, on balance, felt that we should remain in the European Union. I think it is the failure to address problems that leads to this kind of populism, and that I think has happened in the United States. I think it has happened it's happening all across Europe, and Europe has to wake up to it.
We have just 30 seconds remain. I will give you the final word again.
Well, thank you so much for interviewing me, and it's been an enormous pleasure to visit Sudan, Khartoum, all too briefly, I'm afraid, but I've learned a great deal in the very short time that I've been here, and I hope very much that I'll be able to come back.
Honorable Nick Harbert, thank you very much for your time that giving us for this interview and your elaboration and explanation of different issues from health global issues and tuberculosis initiative. We wish you all success for the meeting of the head of the state in New York, and also about your perspective in UK domestic issues and cross-cutting issues also. Thank you very much for that. أعزائي المشاهدين، بهذا نصل إلى ختام هذا البرنامج الذي استضفنا فيه السيد نيك هاربرد، وهو عضو حزب المحافظين في بريطانيا، وأيضا عمل وزيرا في حكومة الظل ديفيد كاميرون، وتقلد عدة مناصب وزارية في البيئة وكذلك الإصلاح الشرطي وكذلك شؤون البيئة وغيرها، وهو الآن يقود مبادرة كبيرة جدا لمحاربة مرض السل، ويزور السودان من أجل يعني تكوين كتلة برلمانية دولية لتقود مبادرة أساسية لمحاربة مرض السل. سعدنا باستضافته في هذه الحلقة. لكم الشكر والتقدير على حسن المتابعة والاهتمام والمشاهدة. تقبلوا تحياتي خالد موسى وتحيات الفريق العامل، وإلى اللقاء في حلقة أخرى. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.